Welcome everyone to today's broadcast from the Clean Energy States Alliance. This is Maria Blaise Costello, and I'm happy to be with you this afternoon. We have a really good program set up for you today, focusing on the benefits of scaling local solar and storage. Warren Leon is our host. He's the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance. And before we turn things over to Warren, I want to go over a quick logistics slide with you. Today's webinar, just so you all know, is being recorded. So Samantha, who usually does these, is on vacation this week. So instead of our usual 24-hour posting of this and getting you a link, it's going to take about a week. So bear with us on that. You can access the audio portion of the webinar either through your telephone or through your mic and speakers connected to your computer. And we encourage you to submit questions throughout the broadcast. You'll see there's a webinar control panel, looks like this. You can make it disappear by clicking this orange box with the arrow if it's in the way of the slide presentation. Enter your questions in here and then be sure to hit send. Warren Leon will be collecting your questions and we'll get to as many as we can as time allows. I think that covers all of it. Again, this will be recorded. Enter your questions as they occur to you throughout the broadcast. Don't wait till the end. Hit send. And with that, I'm going to pass this over to Warren.
Hey, thanks very much, Maria. So if we could go to the next slide, I want to tell you a little bit about the Clean Energy States Alliance. We're a national nonprofit organization. We're a membership organization composed of public agencies, and most of our public agency members are state agencies. You can see them up here. We work with states across the country to advance clean energy in the electricity sector. And if we can go to the next slide, one of our projects is the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. And in that collaborative, we're working with states that have adopted 100% clean energy goals or are considering adopting 100% clean energy goals. We're providing them with knowledge sharing activities and analysis so they can figure out the best ways to actually achieve their 100% clean energy goals. You can go to our website and read about the collaborative and other projects at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and you can sign up for our mailing list there. We're pursuing the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative in partnership with the U.S. Climate Alliance. And one of the activities we're doing for the Clean Energy Collaborative, if we could go to the next slide, is today's webinar. We're really looking forward to this webinar because it's going to address a very important question. When states think about moving their entire electricity system to 100% clean energy, the focus often is initially on large-scale, utility-scale, renewable energy developments. It makes sense to think about that because we're thinking big when we're going to 100% clean energy, but that often leaves out the role of distributed generation, local storage, local solar, and luckily we're going to hear about a report that talks about the importance of making local clean energy a key part of any effort to move our system towards 100% clean energy. And our speaker today is going to be Karl Rabago, and Karl operates Rabago Energy LLC, which is an energy consultancy. He recently led the Pace Energy and Climate Center at the Pace University Law School, where he also taught energy law. He has 30 years experience in energy and climate policy and is recognized as an innovator in utility regulatory issues related to clean and distributed energy services and technologies. He's board chair of the Center for Resource Solutions and is on the board of Solar United Neighbors. He's been a commissioner on the Texas Public Utility Commission, a deputy assistant secretary at the U.S. Department of Energy, Vice President of Distributed Energy Services at Austin Energy, Director of Regulatory Affairs for the AES Corporation and AES Wind, Managing Director and Principal of the Rocky Mountain Institute, and Energy Program Manager for the Environmental Defense Fund. Well, with all that experience, He brought a lot to bear on the new report from Local Solar for All, and he's going to talk to us about it now. Karl, it's up to you.
All right, Warren, thank you very much. You really didn't have to go through all of that bio. When you've been working in the field for 30 years, we probably ought to just use the last 5 or something. But thank you for the kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone today. I'm seeing a number of attendees that is just astounding. Thank you to the Alliance for bringing everybody together. I am only assuming everyone has got all their pre-baking and cooking done for the holiday. Thanks for taking time out of this week. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the results of a modeling exercise, but it's much more than that, because what really excites me about what I'm going to share with you is that it gives us quantitative evidence that something we've known for a very long time and hoped we knew for a very long time is true. And that is, very simply, that distributed energy resources are not just a niche player. They're not just a token complement to an electricity grid that has to go green. They're absolutely fundamental to achieving decarbonization and electrification goals. They're absolutely essential, and they actually make our efforts less expensive than business as usual. So there's the promise. I'm going to show you how we can actually get to ideas like President Biden's 80% clean electricity by 2030 goal without added cost. In fact, by saving everybody money. Now, I'm going to focus on 2030 because that's what's being thrown around in terms of policy terms these days, and because, frankly, we ought to work on what's right in front of us. After 2030, the analysis continues all the way to 2050, and everything I'm talking about extends into the future, but I'm really going to show you how important it is that we get a move on right now, that we don't lose time and we don't lose ground in transitioning to a carbon-free, electrified economy. So with that intro, let's get to work. Let me see if just click it. There we go. Here's what we did. We started by asking, this is our research question, right? We asked, with an advanced grid model that I'm going to tell you more about, the Vibrant Clean Energy Wisdom P planning model, how do we build a grid that can achieve President Biden's clean energy goals at the lowest cost? Now that means achieving, as you see at the bottom here, 80% clean electricity and 50% economy-wide carbon reductions by 2030, and 95% economy-wide reductions and 100% economy-wide electrification by 2050. So that's the research question. Let's see what we learned. What we learned is that growing distributed solar and storage is absolutely essential to achieving that kind of vision. And that kind of vision seems to be what we need if we're really going to do what we're responsible for and responsible to do in terms of achieving a carbon-free, electrified national economy. And by the way, serving as an example for other nations around the world. What does the least cost plan do? Well, it results in a minimum of 103 gigawatts of distributed solar and 137 gigawatts of distributed storage by 2030. But it also enables and gets more value out of nearly 600 gigawatts of utility scale solar and 440 gigawatts of utility scale wind. It will save $109 billion just in utility system costs out to 2030 and more out to 2050. It will add an incremental 1.2 million local solar and storage jobs, a simple function of the fact that these are more labor intense resources, and therefore you get a fringe benefit of the economic value of more jobs, and you get the more jobs as well. We also know from these numbers, just starting to play with the possibilities here, that if we took, for example, 50% of the local solar capacity that the model predicts, and we put it in low and moderate income households and neighborhoods, we could lower energy burden for 8 to 15 million low and moderate income households. By the way, there's nothing really new about this, except for the fact that we're bringing this state-of-the-art, world-class, supercomputer-based kind of model to the electric utility industry like we've always wanted to do. But we're not alone. DOE Solar Future Study, SEIA's 30 by 30 analysis, our previously published local solar roadmap, which we published back in December of last year, all show this is the path to a least cost future. But they also show that distributed generation has to grow faster, 2 to 4 times faster than it has in the previous decade of 2010 to 2020. Okay, let's get to work, talk about how this all happens. We'll start with the status quo, because we need to know, if you want to know where you're going, you got to know where you're standing. Where we're standing right now is that most utility planning is done with models that were designed for 19th century electric grids and 20th century computers. In other words, they hoarded computer capacity, so they simplified problems and reduced complexity in order to fit the solutions and the computations into a model that basically could be shrink wrapped and sold to utilities across the country. As a result, the data sets were limited and large. They didn't really do system planning. They mostly focused on utility scale central station planning. They didn't even look at DERs as a resource. You had to statically input those values if you want to do the modeling. And social and environmental impacts were addressed as an afterthought, as a side issue, or sometimes just as an adder. Instead of actually building around the policy objectives. The simple way to do that, as this diagram shows you, is to basically not analyze anything below the 69 kilovolt line, dividing line, if you will, on the grid. And if you've done production cost modeling or capacity expansion modeling, or you've studied those kinds of models, you know that yes, newer models will allow you to say force in 100 megawatts of energy efficiency or force in 100 megawatts of distributed solar. But the model can't selectively choose what resource is best at every given moment. It can't consider not just the busbar cost of produced energy, the LCOE, if you will, levelized cost of energy, but also the cost of transmitting and distributing that energy at the same time. In other words, it can't really do system-wide optimized and integrated planning. Now, by the way, I just threw out a couple of buzzwords: capacity expansion and production cost modeling. I won't assume everybody knows it, but I will assume everybody has done it. And the reason why is because everybody has had to make the kinds of decisions we make in production cost modeling and in capacity expansion modeling in their ordinary lives. For example, let's say that you choose to make a spaghetti dinner for your family and friends. You go to your cupboard and you find out that you're short on tomatoes. If you rush down to the store, you will encounter a daunting array of canned tomatoes. They're all basically in the same size cans. There's actually 3 sizes, right? The regular size ones, the bigger ones, and then those gigantic things on the bottom shelf that nobody ever buys. I don't know why they're there, but they're there. Anyway, you have to choose between those, and they're pretty much the same in terms of what they'll do to your spaghetti, or to your spaghetti sauce, that is, right? But you can choose whether some of them have little flavors, whether they've got smoked or fire roasted tomatoes or all that other stuff. But you're doing a production cost exercise. Your next increment of tomatoes has to be selected from that menu of choices, and you will try to optimize against your parameters. Typically, cost is the first thing we all think about when we're in a store, but then some of those other things, the flavors, whether it's organic or not organic, you get the drift. Production cost modelings do the same thing for the electricity business. What they do is they say, with each new increment of demand, what resources are available and which will I select? So when people talk about the modeling results of utility scale modeling, they'll say the model selected. The model selected from what it was presented and according to the parameters it was given, right? So you've done production cost modeling. What about capacity expansion modeling? Well, capacity expansion modeling, I'll stick with tomatoes because I was just listening to Guy Clark's Homegrown Tomatoes the other day, a classic, anything by Guy Clark, of course, but the capacity expansion says, well, if I want to have tomatoes often, and I might not, and I want them not just for spaghetti sauce, but also for salads and other purposes, I could always be running down to the store for canned tomatoes, or if it's a mega supermarket, I can get those pink rectangular shaped Roma tomatoes that are real inexpensive, but there's always a lot of them. Or I could grow my own tomatoes. Capacity expansion says, what will I do to change my capacity for obtaining tomatoes? What's the better deal? Capacity expansion decisions are based on life cycle costs, right? And a range of other costs that look at what that capacity is worth to you. Okay, so now that you all can do production cost modeling, and now you know how to do capacity expansion modeling, what I want to do is tell you what's possible if we use better models. And what's possible is that we can open up the barrier between the utility scale side and the retail side, if you will, the distributed side. And every decision we have to make can consider that many more options. And importantly, it can consider options that are just the right size. Remember that third row of tomato cans I was telling you about? If you just need one small can, buying one of those is going to cause waste. It is much more economically efficient to buy the right size can of tomatoes. It is much more economically efficient to buy the right size electric resources. That's what we can do if only we have a computer model that can handle all that complexity. And a computer model that can handle that complexity is what Dr. Chris Clack and his team at Vibrant Clean Energy put together. Now, what's fascinating is we're not talking about some sort of warehouse full of computer panels like out of a sci-fi movie. I've seen his setup. You can buy a terabyte of calculating capacity in something that fits in slightly more than a pack of cards these days. And if you know how to put them together, you can actually put together a supercomputer in a relatively small space. That's what they did. Chris got his start working in big astrophysics type stuff. He showed me a paper once that's got more Greek letters than English language letters, as far as I could tell. But he moved on to do work in weather. And weather modeling is where he understood the idea of models that really thrive on big data. And he started thinking that, well, maybe this could be useful in the utility system space where we really haven't done big data modeling. So the wisdom model, and by the way, much more information about the wisdom model and full technical documentation is available at the Vibrant Clean Energy site. But the wisdom model gave us in the Local Solar for All Coalition an option to finally do the kind of research we wanted to do, the kind of modeling we wanted to do about distributed energy resources. It allows us to consider 10,000 times more data points than the conventional utility models. It allows us to see left and right on this diagram here and to optimize the selection of resources and to integrate our policy choices and to make sure that what we have is a least cost system that meets 100% of the forecasted demand. It starts with weather modeling, which is really data intensive, but which also pays a huge fringe benefit when we get down the road to modeling increasing penetrations of large-scale renewable energy and small-scale renewable energy. And that is that rather than just assuming somebody's forecast of gas prices at the local hub or the Henry hub, wherever you get your gas from, it actually forecasts the weather, meaning it forecasts the fuel. And it does it at a resolution of 3 square kilometers, 1 kilowatt, and 5 minutes. So bad news here, right? You thought you were cool because you understood what 8760 was about. You knew that was how many hours there are in a year. Well, the cool kids now have to know 105,120. Yep, that's how many 5-minute segments there are in a year. And that's the kind of resolution you get with a more powerful model like this. You get the opportunity to forecast your fuel. You get the opportunity to right size your resources. Let's see what this model does and how it does it. Okay, to find out what it does and how it does it, we have to ask it a question. We set up 2 very stark opposing scenarios and ask for the net system cost of reaching our goals under both scenarios. Now, one way in which this wisdom model is fundamentally the same as every other utility model you've seen is that the prime directive for you Star Trek fans is the least cost solution. All right. So what are the parameters? 80% clean electricity by 2030, 50% emissions reductions. I already talked about that. The 95% economy-wide carbon reductions by 2050, and economy-wide electrification of transportation and thermal building loads by 2050. The difference under the optimized local solar and storage model, you use the optimization algorithms that are built into the wisdom model, and you allow those solar and storage resources to be considered as resources. It's in their name. But to starkly contrast with that, the constrained DER turns off the optimization function. The model just can't even see the value of selecting those resources. And to make absolutely sure we are comparing that fundamental thesis of is bigger, less expensive, we turned off new local solar and storage after 2021. Is that realistic? No, of course not. But there's a whole lot of people out there saying that if we're going to get to these carbon goals, we have to do it with large utility scale resources. So we wanted to test that hypothesis as clearly as we possibly could. So that's what we ran in the constrained DER model. And you already know what the results are, but let's look at how things happen. First of all, cumulative distributed photovoltaic capacity, which includes both rooftop and community solar. There are some constraints on the rooftop solar so that it doesn't do crazy things. For example, you can't install a rooftop solar system in the model that's bigger than the load it serves. So, we're not putting canopies on top of houses just to go crazy with the model. By 2030, it's got to move that number from the 2021 projected level of about 30 gigawatts to that 105 gigawatts I talked about before. And distributed storage, which is almost non-existent today when you think about a nationwide 48-state model, has to really grow rapidly in order to take advantage of those variable renewable resources. The savings begin on day one, and they move and accelerate through 2030. They continue in the years after this, but it's positive in terms of total system cost every year starting with this analysis. And more importantly, the model assumes that all utility customers pay for every resource that is acquired, and by the way, all the retirements that are necessary. So if any citizen out there puts in any of their hard-earned money into, like, say, a net metering solution or a community solar subscription, those savings will go up, because this assumes everybody has to, all costs are, as we say in the business, 100% socialized. So there's potential for increased savings. Also, there's potential for increased savings if we enjoy the kind of accelerated cost reductions that the NREL ATB advanced scenario suggests, because we use the conservative or the moderate, the middle of the road scenario, because we wanted to make sure that we weren't being accused of being excessively aggressive. How does it do it? This is where a nerd like me really has fun. The first way it does it is that it allows local solar and storage to smooth the load. The top two diagrams here show you from right to left how variation in distribution demand requires variable response from utility scale generation. And you may have already heard that if those swings get too extreme, much higher costs are incurred in the utility scale side. Chasing that load, if you will, chasing that demand is what drives costs. By the way, this is a chart, just make sure you know what we're talking about. We're talking about the demand as a percentage of the total peak demand across all the summer hours. We just chose them so we'd have a more manageable data set. You see what happens. Things run up and down. The system has to run up and down. That costs money. But with distributed resources optimized, you basically push up the bottom on the gray side. You skinny up the gaps between the peaks. And yes, while it looks like you, quote, overproduce sometimes, you end up with a much smoother load for the utility scale system and much less cost in serving total demand across the system. So the benefit of smoothing the load generates a huge component of the savings. But wait, there's more. The next place is what really jazzes me because it showed what the modelers call emergent behavior. The top of this shape, except for the blue at the far right-hand side, you should follow the gray there. But the top of this shape is your traditional load duration curve for a utility, where normalized percent of demand is on the vertical axis and percent of the year is on the horizontal. We know the system is peaky. We know that we have an asset utilization problem in the utility business, and that we are building a grid that has to serve 100% of demand, but 100% of demand, 90% of demand, 80% of the demand doesn't even occur 10% of the hours in the year. That's a huge cost driver. And we satisfy that peak demand with multi-megawatt peaking plants by and large today, meaning we overshoot the peak and in fact create an incentive to increase demand so that we can pay for the plants that we've built before. By optimizing, turning the switch on to consider DER resources in this model and just having the computing brain power to figure out when those resources are best suited, we shave the light blue off, we fill in the dark blue, and we end up with a flatter curve. But it's not just tailored solutions to demand, and it's not just the smoothing I talked about before. It turns out that distributed energy resources actually allow us to get more value out of our utility scale variable resources, because distributed resources are not just serving demand, they're shaping the demand that the utility system sees. That is profound, it is emergent, and it is exactly what we hope these resources would be able to do. That is more than one trick. In other words, the benefits of growing distributed energy resources to not just meet distributed load, but to create optimization value across the whole system justifies scaling DER up dramatically. I go back to smallest profitable at Rocky Mountain Institute. I created the value of solar tariff when I was at Austin Energy. We've known since back when Karl Weinberg assembled that amazing team at PG&E Research and Development, that right-sized resources had value in individual installations. What we know now is that they have value across the system, and that value is a lot of money. But here's what's really interesting. It doesn't take a complete tear down and rebuild of the system. Yes, we got to get the carbon out. By 2030, we still have some gas. We will eliminate that in this analysis by 2050. But what we're really doing to enable these savings is in those two red circles. We're diversifying the top end of the mix. We're giving ourselves more options that are more distributed. And that's the change that is necessary in order to achieve these savings and get to that clean energy future. The jobs are incremental, and I mentioned they're a fringe benefit. This is not one of those studies where we monetized the jobs and included them in the savings number. That $100+ billion in savings by 2030 is before you calculate the net economic benefit or the economic benefit of the job creation. But it's significant enough that it ought to get the political thinking in your head excited. We hope it does. So pulling it all together again, what does this mean? Well, if we want to save money, we want the least cost solution. If we want to meet our climate and our electrification goals, we got to step on the gas, bad metaphor, for building out distributed solar and the distributed storage that complements it. It will get us growing and getting more value out of our utility scale resources. We'll save money, get extra jobs, and if we're smart about it, we can do something with those savings. I want to pause here for a minute and put on my once upon a time was a utility regulator hat, because When I looked at these results, there are three thoughts that immediately come to mind. The first thought is, I don't have to choose between small and large. This is an and strategy, not an or strategy. And getting out of that pickle is a pretty nice thing for a regulator or a policymaker. Second, these savings are something that I haven't seen available to planners in the 30 years plus I've been in this business. To actually have a future that is less expensive, you would have to go back to the 30s or 40s or 50s to find 1930s, 1940s, or 1950s, right? We now have basically headroom that could allow for uncertainty or excess costs, or that policymakers could redirect towards targeted objectives like energy justice or accelerating particular technologies. Third, we've got to do a lot of planning work in the future. And over the past 30 years that I've been in this business, we have committed trillions of dollars, probably at least hundreds of billions of dollars, on resource planning based on the output of a single model sponsored by a single witness. This model, this analysis gives us an opportunity to go down the road towards taking multiple looks at the problems in front of us. And these insights are worth considering. The analogy for me is return on equity. You would never, ever decide return on equity in a rate case based on the results of a single model. And that only sets return on equity between rate cases. This is about making commitments to resources that will have multi-decade-long lives. And I think regulators and policymakers would appreciate having multiple looks at the question before they answer it. So wrap all this up and open up for questions. What did we know before? Well, we knew local solar is the most charismatic energy resource we've seen in our lifetimes. We know that in the individual cases, they allow us to target the benefits of clean energy, and that we can even target these in more equitable ways across society and get job benefits because of that high labor component that comes with distributed resources. Those benefits, those potentially directed benefits, and that popularity we knew. What we know now is those system-wide benefits that come from a comprehensive look at our distributed resource opportunity. But this is not the time to slow the development and deployment of local solar and storage, that in fact we need to double or quadruple the growth over the next decade. But if we do, we will have the resources available to us to focus on some really good opportunities, like achieving Justice 40 goals, providing an insurance policy for the transmission and utility scale deployments that we need to also make improved grid resilience that comes from a more distributed system, those jobs I've already talked about, accelerating progress towards our goals. We've got some policy recommendations. I'll leave off on those right now, but we can discuss them if you want to. I don't want to, it's not my job to tell you what the policy is, but to think about I encourage you to think about how policy might reflect the learning from this analysis, and then what you can do at your individual state level, if that's where you're working. And with that, I can go to questions. Oh, I'm sorry. One thing I want to emphasize. At localsolarforall.org, we've posted the results of this analysis. The easiest way for me is I go to the press pages, because there's a press release for this report, and then it'll have hyperlinks for this slide deck, for the narrative of this study, and for a list of people who have sort of been part of this coalition and have endorsed the results, as well as analysis we've done for California, for Illinois, for New York, and our big, deep analysis that we did for the nation, the lower 48, back in December of last year. So there's more resources available. That concludes my presentation, and now hopefully we have a lot of time to talk. You can shut off the slideshow if you want to, or however you want to do it. Maria, thank you for managing this again. And I will turn on my camera so you can see me and my Energy Alabama t-shirt, which says, everything I do is electric.
Hey, thanks very much, Karl, for that fascinating and eloquent presentation. We do have a lot of questions, And I
Good.
want to start with a few definitional ones just so we understand all our terms and what actually the model is talking about. What's your definition of distributed generation, distributed storage, local solar for storage? For example, is community solar done at the community level included in what you're talking about?
Yeah, so the answer is yes to the last question, and the answer to the first question is any resource interconnected at 69 kV or below, basically substation kind of level, is considered a distributed resource in this model. I mentioned before that it considers for distributed solar, it's considering community solar, which is charged a little bit of distribution cost, technically, to move its load around within the distribution system. Net metering or rooftop type solar, the rooftop solar is also in there. It's not charged a distribution cost because it's serving load at the premises, but it is limited by that sizing. It cannot be bigger than the load it serves. And the model also calculates to ensure that it is not installed unless it actually saves money for the customer, compared against all the other resources they could acquire. Because we didn't want to just artificially jam the system with rooftop solar. The model considers distributed storage, any storage installed below 69. It also considers some demand side resources. But to be honest with you, because this is a capacity model and it can't control the life of demand side management, it tends not to select that. It tends to solve, as the traditional models do, for the generating capacity. The storage, what the storage does is, there's a slight explanation here, but there's some people going, well, gee, what are we going to do with electricity markets when renewables are the marginal resource, right? And somebody will inevitably say, well, markets will clear on renewables. That's not technically possible. You can't clear a market on a zero or negative cost resource. I'm a fan of Michael Liebrecht's approach, which is to say the market will clear on firm spread, meaning what is the cost to take this practically zero cost energy option and have it meet the needs at the particular time and location that it is needed. So the model really, because it ensures 100% reliability and satisfaction of demand, i.e. it has, in modeling terms, perfect foresight, it will, but short-sighted, it will maximize the use of low-cost energy and then use storage to firm it. And that's what gives you this trade-off. Sometimes that utility scale is the least cost, even with transmission and distribution. Sometimes that distributed resource below the 69 kV that doesn't have to pay transmission is the least cost resource, especially when the transmission gets expensive. So that's how it works around that 69 kV line and gets our definition straight.
Good. And one other thing about the model, it's looking at 80% clean electricity by 2030. Two questions that came in. First, what's included in clean electricity in the model? And secondly, did the model consider the increased electricity load that may result from transitioning to electrification in the transportation and building sectors?
Yep. So clean electricity, as we're using the term in this analysis, is any of the resources available to the model. See how I talk like a model person? Available to the model for selection that do not emit carbon or other pollutants, which means it eliminates the fossil resources. It technically has a choice of some biomass resources, but it doesn't select many of those because of the cost. Most of the analysis only will allow an incumbent to keep running for a while. It will, in later years, because of the projections that EIA and NREL use, it will, in later years, potentially select SMRs, small modular reactors, or other innovative technologies. Chris has also been doing some runs where he plugs in some high voltage DC. We put all those in the innovative technology range. They tend to get selected around the 2045 to 2050 time period because it takes that long for their costs to look attractive to the model. In terms of electrification, here's the really freaking cool thing. The more load served with this optimization capacity, the lower the cost. So, because what you have is you have more ways to take advantage of those zero cost renewable resources. So when we ran the sort of the full model back a year ago and ran it on electrification scenarios, you know, we had a nationwide roughly $500 billion savings without electrification to 2050. We had 1.5 trillion in utility system costs to 2050 when you add the electrification of load. And that's, by the way, without even plugging in vehicle to grid.
Let me ask a couple questions about the modeling before we get into some questions about the implications of it. One person asked, isn't what this is doing what GE Maps Mars does? And doesn't the ISOs already optimize energy sources and do what you're talking about doing in the modeling?
I'm not sure what GE's Maps does, so I'll have to pass on that one. On the last one, if that were the case, we wouldn't need a 2222. Distributed resources don't have access to the models. And by the way, this allows me to make a key point. This is a model. This is a roadmap, right? You decide to get drunk and take a wrong turn, you know, while you're driving, you're not going to end up where you're going. You decide to take a side trip just for any other purpose or stay a night along the road and not make progress on your journey, that's what's going to happen. This is the roadmap. This, for some of us old enough, this is the old triptychs that AAA would send you if you were planning your vacation. I think they do it online now, right? They'll send you a PDF. But execution is going to be everything on this. Right now, our ISOs don't look at resources at this scale and don't have models that can handle this. You do a Plexus run, an Aurora run. I think Aurora, the minimum size is 50 megawatts for a resource addition, right? And they don't do dynamic selection of distributed resources. They allow you to shove in 100 megawatts or 150 megawatts in order to accomplish that. The ISOs are not doing this analysis yet, but there's no reason why they can't.
Well, let's talk about that issue. You said that this is a good roadmap. It's where ideally we would want to go. The question is, can we really get there? And I want to raise two questions related to that. Is, you know, what's the reason to think that if a lot more distributed generation, distributed storage gets built, it actually would be used in the ways that you're talking about here, both in terms of ensuring that the storage is controlled in some way so that it actually is applied at the times you need it, and that the ISOs and the utilities are bought into enough that they're taking advantage of this distributed resource that may be out there as more of it gets installed.
Right. So let's be honest. Adding more distributed resources does shave a little off the top of the amount of utility scale resources. If you're unable to see the benefit of distributed resources and you think all solutions are utility scale resources, you might not like it. If you're in the business of utility scale resources and not in the business of distributed resources, you may not like it. Executing a plan well requires leadership. And to a large extent, it will require resources, right? We need our regulators to step up and to demand more ways to looking at the problems. Simply, a good way to start would be to ask better questions. I hope that this kind of information actually empowers better question asking by regulators and policymakers, because that'll be the first step. Can utilities have a future that is not just lost revenue due to distributed resources? Yes, they can. They could earn fantastic returns for their shareholders under performance-based regulatory approaches where they are rewarded for enabling this technology. They've got huge investment opportunities in developing the distributed energy resource management systems and infrastructure necessary to make this grid work in a way that takes advantage of these resource attributes. But if you choose not to do that, hey, you know, I'm sure there's somebody still buying buggy whips.
Well, along those lines, one person asked, they said, you talked about there's going to be $109 billion worth of savings. That means there's someone who's getting less money than they would under the current scenario. What are the entities that are getting less money under this new scenario? Who are the losers?
Yeah, you know, it's when I was teaching energy law, I told everybody that, you know, I would do two things. I would start, I'd say the course koan is in the largest, most successful free market capitalistic society the world has ever known, why is a major fundamental resource and service provided by monopolies? And the answer is because, at least when we got started, it was the best way to get it done. It's not necessarily the best way to get it done, but it's not necessarily the worst way to get it done. They just have to do different things. Where does that $109 million come from? Well, now it's sort of like a Bobby Kennedy speech, RFK speech at Kansas State. In cost plus regulation, right? The same thing the Defense Department uses that we use in the utility business. Everybody knows that wealth is determined by atoms, right? It's how many more atoms. That's why you get to things like nuclear power plants. And I say this as one of the few people alive who has actually had to vote a nuclear power plant into rates, okay, which I did at the Texas Commission. But you get more atoms there, and I'm not talking about uranium atoms, I'm talking about 12 foot of concrete and all the rest of it that comes with it, and atoms equals wealth. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the smartest solution, it's just the one that has the biggest infrastructure. So we need to reconfigure what we reward our utilities for, but they're smart enough and professional enough, I think they'll beat a path to that result if we stop just rewarding this sort of, another cultural reference, as Dr. Seuss explained in the Lorax, biggering and biggering. So that 109 million is potential waste, economic waste, things you wouldn't have to spend money on in order to get the same level of service. That to me is the definition of economic waste.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about the use of the model. Have you gotten a reaction from the Biden administration to this analysis? Have they bought into the model and potentially using it? And on top of that, is there anyone else using the model besides local solar for all?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. It gives us a chance to explain that Vibrant Clean Energy is just a contractor to local solar for all. And I know for a fact that Chris is doing lots of modeling for lots of people. I will tell you that culturally, I know how it's going for utilities, and he has utility clients. They do the model, in secrecy. They do the analysis under the wraps because they don't know if they want to share the results. They don't know what it's going to tell them about what they're doing. But a lot of utilities are paying him to do this kind of analysis. There are other entities, state energy offices in some cases, that are getting runs, and others. So there's people using it that I don't know about and I will never know about because I'm not in that business. That's Vibrant Clean Energy's business. We know what we used it for, and we wanted to do these bold national studies as well as enable these key state studies. We're going to try to do some more, but we want to just make people aware that there's an option out there, right? That there's another way of looking at things. That's our objective, is to make people aware that this is basically within your hands. I will also say that I think it costs less but I'm not sure. And it depends on what you ask of the model. I think it costs less than trying to get a license to one of the really big models, and that you can do more iterations at lower incremental cost. But that's just based on our experience as as hiring him, Vibrant Clean Energy and Slack as contractors. I don't know what everybody else's experience would be. I'm not, I'm certainly proud of the results and I'm impressed by the model, but I'm not in his business. Did I answer everything?
Yep, you
Okay.
got it all there. Thank you. In terms of estimating the savings, does the model consider things like replacement of batteries and solar panels and maintenance on all this distributed generation in terms of thinking what the net savings would be?
Yes, it uses sort of these levelized cost of energy type values for each resource according to NREL ATB with degradation rates, like your 0.5% per year for solar and things like that, your inverter replacement rates, your useful life rates for your storage devices and when they have to be replaced. It does that also, by the way, for distribution infrastructure and transmission lines, which is really cool, right? So you can actually look at all those resources from a system-wide perspective. So yeah, it uses a set of assumptions, and by the way, those assumptions can be tailored by the contractor. You can say, no, I think you're, like when we did California, the NREL numbers were a little bit lower than what California was using in its California Energy Commission. So we just went to the California Energy Commission and said, what are your numbers? That's what we're going to use because we want this to be more apples to apples. I know that Chris did a study, I believe in one or both of the Carolinas, where they just took the utility model that they ran in Plexus or something and said, give us your table of assumptions, and entered those number for number into the wisdom model to see whether the optimization function generated those incremental benefits. It did.
And in the model and in the analysis that was done, is there a ratio of PV to storage that's used? Or how is it determined how much PV you're talking about, how much storage you're talking about?
It does it by doing that incremental time slice analysis. It says, I'm standing at the store, I've got to buy a can of tomatoes. I'm hoping this metaphor holds up. And it says, which one do I pick, right? And which one I pick is partly preordained by you're only allowed to look at organic, or you're only allowed to look at hunts, or you're only allowed, whatever the assumption, those are assumptions. Then it asks, what's the right size and the least cost? And then it goes a little further, and this is where the metaphor is going to get strained. It asks, how much gas did I spend driving to and from the store to get it in order to get it into the pot for the spaghetti? So that, what it does is it sits there and it says, what do you got for me? And it'll say, I got some 2-cent utility scale solar. Okay, where is it? Well, it's 100 miles away. Okay, what's the transmission cost to get it there? What's the distribution cost to get it to load? Stack those up. Now, what would it cost to put solar on that roof? Well, you can't, it's full. Oh, never mind. Okay, what would it cost to do community solar? Okay, it would cost this amount. Is that amount plus a distribution charge lower than utility scale plus transmission and distribution charge? And you can see why you need all this computing capacity, because you do that every 5 minutes, 105,120 times a year.
Yeah. Well, here's another one in term that makes it complicated as well. How does the model consider the fact that there might be cost increases for distributed energy resource grid connection as the DERs make the current utility rate plans unsustainable due to reductions in income from volumetric charges?
Yeah, that's an execution question, right? I mean, all we can do is say we think it's always going to cost 1.2 cents or something, on top of the current cost of the electricity for interconnection, or $10 per kilowatt year, or whatever, some number, right? And you can put that in as an assumption and add it in and spread it out over the output, or however you want to do it. But if you allow somebody to come in there and say, oh, I need a 1-year delay so I could do an interconnection study on your rooftop system, then all bets are off. Again, it's a roadmap. You choose to deviate, go sightseeing, spend an extra day at the hotel on the road. That's part of the future. All I can tell you is how to get there at the least cost with the cleanest way possible.
Yeah, and in terms of another complication, how will this work in the long term where there are competing utility service territories? Does this really require a degree of coordination and collaboration among utilities that doesn't exist in many places at the moment?
We did something like that analysis a year ago. What we did is we reduced friction between RTOs. So, sort of made the cost of moving between RTOs a little lower in several key ways in order to test this increased cooperation idea. And guess what? You get more savings, right? So here's what we do know. When we model the full 48, it may be that, and this is just hypothetical because I haven't dug in this deep. It may be that Nebraska is the best place to put the wind for Chicago, right? Even with the cost of transmission that might be associated with it. But it may be that Nebraska doesn't want to cooperate, or the states in between don't want to cooperate, or the RTOs can't communicate, or whatever it is, right? The least cost is one that allows you to optimize, and optimization, more options means more optimization. So the bigger the model and the more assumptions of cooperative behavior, the more you would save money. But we could quickly drift into some constitutional questions here if we weren't careful. When you constrained by a state or constrained by a utility within a state, you make boundary assumptions like we do today. If you're running an Aurora or Plexus model, you say, well, how much is my maximum input? How much is my maximum export? And take those as boundary conditions, and then you optimize within. Here's what I will tell you. The benefits of optimizing distributed resources are always there. In fact, we know from value of solar analysis, from small as profitable, we know they're always there down to the utility of one, right, on your rooftop. You will lose some benefit if you constrain your geography. So planning for, this is why energy planners and energy staffers are such an essential profession for the future of this planet. Planning for reducing friction between cities and utilities, between utilities and each other, between states and states, between regions and regions is the most important thing we can do to finding the least cost pathway to climate responsibility. Pay raise to every energy staffer.
Good. Well, we're coming near the end of the hour. I have time for one more question. I want to thank all those folks who wrote in with such interesting questions. I'm sorry we haven't been able to ask all of them. We will share the whole list of questions with Karl so he'll see what other things were on people's minds. My last question is actually two-part. One, someone asked is, what are some of the key regulatory hurdles to moving in the direction you're talking about? And then the second part of that question is, what else do you want to leave with people as famous last words here as we wrap up the webinar?
Yep. Now, by the way, I did forget to answer earlier on. We are trying to have, and we're going to have some conversations with some folks in and around the Biden administration and the planning done there. I think we've already connected with some of them, but we're going to do more. The regulatory hurdle, we're at the basic level of this right now, although we have to move fast. The regulatory hurdle is just not having the knowledge, awareness, or willingness to ask these harder questions. And now we have a way we can answer the harder questions. So just ask more and better questions. Ask the utility. I found testimony recently in a case where, I said, the right solution is to optimize these resources in the planning. And the answer from the utility was that can't be done. I said, well, wait a minute, you know, it can be done, right? It can be done. We can do this. We can bring supercomputing, high data loving analysis to the utility business, and we better. So ask, why not, right? And ask utilities to look into this. Ask, enable energy regulatory staffs and energy offices to do this kind of analysis so they can stand toe to toe with those black boxes from the quote, the other side, from other parties, right? Just have, maybe the most important thing is understand that what we're telling you is that it's okay to have a vision of a clean electricity system and a clean economy for our nation and beyond. It's okay to have that vision. It's not silly. It's not impossible. Just start asking for it. That's where I'll leave it.
Hey, thanks for sharing what's important and sort of impressive vision for the future. I hope everybody will go and look up and read the publications from Local Solar for All. And thank you, Karl, and thanks everybody for joining us. And I hope you'll be back for future webinars of the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. Thanks, everyone.
I'd love to. Thanks for your leadership. Thanks to everyone on the phone and on the Zoom. And thanks to the Alliance for convening this. I'm honored to have spent some time with you. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Be safe.